Chapter 23. As the golden hues of summer gave way to the crisp breeze of autumn, the capital gradually returned to its usual bustle. Nobles who had spent the season in their respective territories began making their way back, their carriages rolling through the gates of the imperial city. The palace, once quiet during the vacation period, was once again lively with the return of courtiers and officials. Athanasia sat comfortably in the garden pavilion, sipping on a chilled fruit tea as she watched the servants prepare for the autumn festival. Curious, she turned to Lillian, who stood attentively by her side. "I wonder what Countess Rosalia and Jeanette have been up to during the summer," she mused, lazily stirring the ice in her glass. "I assumed they went to their estate for the holidays, didn't they?" Lillian hesitated before responding. "The Countess did return to her territory, Your Highness, but the second princess remained in the Sapphire Palace." Athanasia nearly dropped her glass. "She what?" "She was not permitted to leave," Lillian clarified, lowering her voice slightly. "Her Highness is still on probation." Athanasia blinked in disbelief. "All summer? She's still under probation?" "Yes, Princess." For a moment, Athanasia sat in stunned silence. She had assumed that Jeanette had left with Countess Rosalia, spending the season enjoying the countryside, far removed from the weight of the palace. But to learn that she had remained locked away in the Sapphire Palace for months. That was something she hadn't expected. She set down her drink and stood up, dusting off her skirts. "Send for Jeanette." Lillian bowed. "At once, Your Highness." As the maid departed to carry out the order, Athanasia tapped her fingers against the pavilion railing, deep in thought. Jeanette had been locked up all summer? What exactly had she been doing in that lonely palace all this time? Inside the vast yet eerily silent halls of the Sapphire Palace, Jeanette sat motionless in a plush chair near the towering window, her vacant gaze fixed on the gardens beyond the glass. The once vibrant greenery that had captivated her upon her arrival now felt like a taunting sight, so close, yet entirely out of reach. The days had long since blurred into one another, melting into an unchanging monotony. At first, she had spent her confinement clinging to hope. Perhaps the Emperor would change his mind. Perhaps Countess Rosalia would send for her. Perhaps someone, anyone, would come and tell her that this was all a misunderstanding. But as weeks turned to months, the realization set in like a numbing cold. No one was coming. No explanations were given. She was simply here, confined to the palace, without a word of when or if she would ever be allowed to leave. Even now, she still sat in her nightgown, having long since abandoned any enthusiasm for dressing up when no one was around to see it. A sharp knock on the door pulled her from her trance, though she barely mustered the energy to turn her head. Before she could respond, the door creaked open, and a maid stepped inside. "Princess Athanasia has summoned you," the maid announced flatly. Jeanette blinked, slowly sitting up. It took her a moment to process the words. "Athanasia wants to see me?" "Send her in," Jeanette said softly. The maid scoffed. "Let me rephrase that." She strode forward with an air of impatience. "You have been summoned by Princess Athanasia. Get dressed." Jeanette flinched at the sharp tone. Before she could react, the maid walked over to her wardrobe, pulled out a plain dress, and tossed it onto her lap with little care. The rough fabric brushed against her fingers, a simple brown and white dress, long-sleeved and undecorated, far from the elegant gowns she once wore. "Don't keep the princess waiting," the maid added curtly as she moved to help Jeanette dress. There was no warmth in her actions, only efficiency and a quiet disdain, as if she found the very task of assisting Jeanette beneath her. Jeanette didn't protest. She simply allowed herself to be dressed, her thoughts too heavy to argue. Her long brown hair was left straight, with only a single, modest hairpin to keep it from falling into her face. The morning sun was bright as she stepped outside, and she instinctively raised a hand to shield her eyes. The fresh air, the sight of the sky, it was almost overwhelming after so many months indoors. As the guards escorted her toward the Emerald Palace, Jeanette felt an unfamiliar weight settle in her chest. Athanasia had called for her. But why? Jeanette walked silently as the guards led her past the familiar path of the palace grounds, further and further away from the Sapphire Palace. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fresh blooms and damp earth. As she neared the private residences, something caught her attention. A grand structure, nestled near the princess's private library, one that hadn't been there before. Her steps slowed as she took in the sight. A greenhouse. But not just any greenhouse, this one was unlike anything she had ever seen, far grander than the one in the Alpheus mansion back in the capital. The towering glass walls reflected the sunlight, shimmering like a jewel among the gardens. Lush greenery pressed against the panes, as if eager to spill out into the open air. Curiosity gnawed at her, and she hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. A wave of warmth greeted her, the air thick with the fragrance of flowers, soil, and fresh leaves. It felt less like a greenhouse and more like a forest enclosed in glass. Tall plants stretched toward the ceiling, plumeria, their fragrant blossoms cascading from high branches, climbing roses weaving through trellises, and ivies curling around the carved stone pillars that lined the paths. Wildflowers bloomed in controlled chaos, lending the space a dreamlike, untouched beauty. Then came the sounds, chirping, rustling, and soft, distant coos. Jeanette turned her gaze upward and found herself surrounded by birds. Bluebirds and yellow canaries flitted between branches, their songs filling the air with a cheerful melody. A snowy barn owl perched lazily on a thick vine, its golden eyes blinking slowly. A pair of cockatoos chattered among themselves, their voices blending with the rustling leaves. It was like stepping into another world, one of warmth, color, and life. Before she could take in more, a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Princess Jeanette. She turned to see Lillian, the ever-dutiful nanny of Princess Athanasia, standing by one of the winding stone paths. The woman's expression was unreadable, though there was no hostility in her voice. "The princess is waiting for you," Lillian said before turning on her heel, expecting Jeanette to follow. Jeanette complied without a word, weaving through the towering flora until they reached a secluded area where a grand wooden table had been set up. At its center sat Athanasia. Jeanette stilled, her fingers instinctively tightening around the simple fabric of her dress. Athanasia was radiant as ever, draped in an elegant white and yellow off-shoulder dress, the fabric light and airy. Her golden curls had been pulled back into a loose ponytail, though a few strands still framed her face, their natural waves giving her an effortlessly regal appearance. Perched on Athanasia's delicate finger was a yellow canary, its tiny wings fluttering as it chirped softly. The sight of her half-sister, glowing in the warm light of the greenhouse, made Jeanette glance down at herself. Simple white and brown. Plain. Unadorned. She let out a quiet sigh. She wasn't sure why she even bothered comparing. Athanasia turned, her bright blue eyes locking onto Jeanette's. A warm, polite smile graced her lips. "You've arrived. Please, have a seat." Jeanette gave a small nod before lowering herself onto the cushioned chair across from her. Almost immediately, tea and delicate cakes were served on fine porcelain, the scent of freshly baked pastries mixing with the floral air. Silence settled between them as Jeanette carefully picked up her teacup. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than usual. "I don't remember seeing this place before." Her gaze wandered around the greenhouse, taking in its impossible beauty. Athanasia's smile grew slightly as she gently stroked the canary's feathers. "That's because it wasn't here before." She set the bird down onto its perch before glancing at Jeanette. "Father had it built for me recently." Jeanette stilled. "Father, built this for Athanasia?" As if sensing her unspoken question, Athanasia continued, her voice light. "Lucas made it, actually. With magic. Just a snap of his fingers." She mimicked the motion playfully before lifting her teacup to her lips. Jeanette lowered her gaze to the golden liquid in her own cup. There was no point in dwelling on it. Athanasia had always been the beloved one. That much had been clear from the moment she arrived at the palace. "I see," Jeanette said simply. Her tone held no anger, no jealousy, only quiet acceptance. Athanasia, however, noticed. No jealousy? No resentment? She had expected some bitterness, some lingering sense of hurt in Jeanette's expression. But there was none. She set down her teacup, her fingers resting lightly against the porcelain. Athanasia's gaze was unwavering as she stared at Jeanette. The contrast between their expressions was striking. The princess's sharp, focused intensity clashed with Jeanette's aloofness, her indifference as evident as the distance between them. "Why don't you come forward with the truth?" Athanasia's voice was steady, each word weighed with accusation. "It was your aunt who slandered me." Jeanette didn't respond immediately, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her teacup. "You know," she said flatly, her voice distant, as though she were speaking to someone who didn't concern her. "Everybody knows," Athanasia snapped back. "So why are you still here, on probation, doing nothing to clear your name?" Jeanette gave her a sidelong glance, but remained quiet, her lips pressed into a tight line. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Then why am I still here? Still stuck under this probation?" Athanasia leaned forward slightly, her eyes burning with the weight of her words. "You could end it now," she said sharply. "If you tell the truth. You could end this and clear your name. But you choose not to. Why?" Jeanette glanced down at her teacup, her fingers twisting the delicate porcelain. She didn't meet Athanasia's gaze, the air thick with unsaid things. Athanasia's patience thinned. "I don't understand why you're asking me this," Jeanette finally mumbled, her voice quiet and barely audible. Athanasia studied her for a long moment, her eyes narrowing. "Jeanette, if your aunt were the one to poison me, to frame me, and if that led to my execution, would you forgive her? Would you still say she did it for your sake?" Jeanette's expression faltered, the weight of the question clearly pressing on her, but she remained silent. Her lips parted, but no answer came. Athanasia's gaze hardened. "I don't know why you're asking me this," Jeanette repeated, though the words lacked their former indifference, as if she were struggling with something internal. Athanasia pressed on, her voice colder. "Did your aunt ask you not to say anything?" The silence stretched on, long and unbearable. Jeanette's eyes lowered, refusing to answer, and Athanasia took it as confirmation. The truth was there, unspoken but undeniable. Athanasia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She stared down at Jeanette, her voice no longer offering any room for mercy. "You've made your decision, Jeanette," she said coldly. "Be prepared to face the consequences. No one will protect you from the fallout. Your actions, or inactions, will define you." Jeanette's gaze snapped up, but she couldn't bring herself to respond. The weight of Athanasia's words hung heavily in the air, and the princess turned on her heel, her words lingering like an echo. "Since you've already made your choice, you will have to live with it. No one else will carry the burden for you." Athanasia's final words were a warning, not an invitation for further discussion. The consequences of Jeanette's decisions were set into motion. Like, comment and subscribe to be notified for updates in the series.